we didn't change a policy. We're just clarifying what the church has already taught. And we started this work 2 years ago, and it was in conjunction with a Vatican document that was released on the true identity of the human person from a Catholic school's perspective. And so this isn't something new. This isn't something changed. This isn't us being just responding to a political situation. This has been in the works for a long time. The other thing is this is compassionate. So compassion is one of those words that when you're thinking about true compassion, you're telling someone the truth in a loving way. You're helping them through it. So our policy doesn't just say we're not going to use pronouns that aren't in conformity with God-given biological sex and leave it at that. Our policy is saying that this is the framework under those things that reveal the truth and those things that do not reveal the truth. And within that framework, we're going to walk with people, and we're going to walk with the families and the children to help them to understand who they truly are and to give them the assistance that they actually need. So this isn't black and white. This isn't, we laid down this policy, and if you have gender dysphoria, leave. That's not what this is. This is a framework for teachers. It's a framework for principals, for pastors, for those that work in the parishes, to be able to walk with the people that come to them in true compassion in the way that God wants them to walk with them. That for some reason it's believed when you're born you have this arbitrary assignment of a gender that you can decide to later change. The reality is you have a God-given biological sex that's not an accident. It is who you are, and it's not some sort of extra piece of the person. So by making sure that our pastors and our principals are walking with people who are having problems with gender dysphoria and really showing them the truth, it's not being uncompassionate, it is actually being compassionate. Because what happens in the secular world when children especially are affirmed in their gender dysphoria, in their confusion, is it does more damage than good. There's a pathway that leads to damage for a person's entire life because there's a misplaced compassion. It depends on the age of the child. So if you have a child that's prepubescent or just started puberty, it's common to be sent to a gender identity or gender transition clinic, in which the clinician there would be what they call gender affirming. So gender affirming is one of these doublespeak things that you hear out in the secular world, where gender affirming does not mean that they're being affirmed in their God-given biological sex. They're being affirmed in the gender that they identify with, even if that's not a gender at all. And so the young child who's sent to these gender clinics would first be affirmed in their gender confusion, because gender dysphoria, which is an actual diagnosis, is very difficult to do at an early age, although it is now being done earlier and earlier. So they'll be affirmed, can be put on puberty blockers at that point. So these are our prepubescent, early puberty children, put on a puberty blocker. A puberty blocker is simply a drug that will stop the hormones that have an onset of puberty. So they stop or delay puberty from happening. And what goes on at that time is then the child is given a period of time in which they never develop properly. So if it's a male, he will never get male features. He'll never hit puberty and do those things. If it's a female, she will never hit puberty and begin her period, start growing breasts. None of those things will happen. And if the puberty blockers are stopped at some point, so if the parents recognize we shouldn't be doing this, they stop it, the child will then eventually start puberty. And so those are reversible. There is a chance at that point to stop the transition and to allow the child to hit puberty. Now, the question of delaying a child's onset of puberty until when all of their classmates and all of their peers are already hitting puberty, and then the long-term effects, which the the clinicians are very aware of. They don't have long-term studies on. Those are things that are yet to be seen, how that works. But right now, that is the option. After puberty blockers, or for children who have already gone through puberty, there's something called cross-sex hormones. So they're different. You've got puberty blockers that stop the onset of puberty, and then cross-sex hormones, which are what they sound like. So they are for people who are one God-given biological sex, and it does the opposite thing to them. It's a cross-sex. So for a male with the intention of becoming a female, that male would be given estrogen and progesterone. They'd be given androgen blockers. So there are certain hormones in the human body that all people have, but are more dominant in one sex or another. So men and boys tend to have testosterone and androgens at a higher level, and estrogen and progesterone at a lower level, where women will have higher estrogen and progesterone and testosterone and androgens at a lower level. So the intention here is to give somebody of a certain biological sex, a certain God-given biological sex, a separate hormone, and to block their natural hormones. So for a male, you would block the androgens and the testosterone. You'd give them estrogen and progesterone. What this would do is it would shrink his testicles. It would stop the function, the normal male function of the genitals. It would stop the growth of facial hair. If facial hair has not yet begun to grow because there was puberty blockers, it would never start to grow. You have a feminizing of the voice that would happen. You have a feminizing of the features. So there'd be a loss in muscle mass. You would have smoother contours, different kind of skin even in a lot of cases. And then the estrogen and progesterone would then accentuate those effects. They can cause breast development, so breasts can actually grow. And some of these things are permanent. Infertility, so everything that affects the fertility is typically permanent. Breast changes are permanent. You can have facial hair changes that are permanent. These are all things that would be permanent down the road. For a female, you would stop the breasts from growing. They would turn into more muscle mass. A lot of times there's this kind of like in between of breasts and muscle mass that then down the road would end up having to result in surgery. You've got facial hair that will grow. A lot of times that's permanent. So for girls, they'll have a permanent 5 o'clock shadow or have to shave all the time. There's a deepening of the voice that can be permanent. You have infertility that can be permanent. All of these sorts of things that are happening to her body that just simply can't be changed at that point. And so that's the cross-sex hormone part of it. You also have the social impact. So there's still, at this moment, a tendency to hold off on surgery. Thank God. So there's still a tendency to hold off on surgery. So what they have is the social impact where a lot of teenagers are then wearing prosthetic pieces that are, so prosthetic breasts or prosthetic buttocks or all of these different body parts to make them look like the other gender. And that is something that's happening on a regular basis while a child will await surgery. So then after all of that, the last step, and not everybody goes through it. So this is one of those surgical things that doesn't always happen, is that then you start surgically changing genitalia, breasts, those sorts of things to attempt to match the person and what they're claiming to be and what they're trying to be. And those are permanent. They're not easily reversible. They're changes that the person, that doesn't fix the problem, right? So all of this intention, from puberty blockers, cross-sex hormones, social changes to then surgical changes, is intended to help and change and cure the gender dysphoria, which it doesn't do. Not to mention the fact that these people, these poor children, need to see a doctor to maintain these changes for the rest of their life in most cases. So depending on the case and the sex hormones they're getting, they're seeing a doctor every 3 to 6 months for the rest of their life. And there are no studies done long-term on the long-term effects of what these hormones do. I was on the Seattle Children's Hospital website and their gender clinic, and they have an entire section on these hormones that say, we don't know what they do long-term, we don't know what the long-term risks are, and there's links to breast cancer for both females and males because of the types of hormones being given. They just simply don't know. So it's a giant experiment on our children. I think the first thing to remember is that parents who are trying to assist their children in transitioning are doing what they think at that moment is best to help that child from a mental health standpoint. Like you're saying, they don't want to see their child suffer. And so most of these parents are doing this to try and help the child. The thing that's not well talked about, or isn't really talked about at all, is that immediately following surgery, assuming they're done surgery, so let's just talk about surgery for a second. Immediately following surgery, there tends to be a boost in mental health, right? So there's hope. There's this idea or this thought that I'm going to be fixed, I'm not going to have these problems anymore. But the long-term studies that have looked at this, the most famous one done in Sweden, which is a 30-year longitudinal study, because Sweden's been doing this for quite some time, shows that 20% of people who go through this full transitioning commit suicide. Actually commit suicide. And so, which is significantly higher than the general population, and it's significantly higher than their counterparts who do not, who suffer from gender dysphoria and then do not go further. And so from this aspect of, like I said, a misplaced compassion, a desire to help this person, the truth is you're really doing more harm if you're going all the way through with a transition, because the studies that we do have long term show that these individuals are at much higher risk for suicide and mental health problems. So from an ethical standpoint, I think you're looking very much at, this is an experiment. So you're affirming somebody in something that has never been truly tested. And I think from an ethical standpoint, you simply can't do that, because this isn't like you're testing a product that has a very low potential to do any sort of long-term damage. You are testing something that is life-altering in a way that we've never really seen socially before. And so just from an ethics standpoint, it hasn't been sufficiently tested. And the countries that have been doing it long term actually show adverse outcomes. So ethically, it's not kind, it's not compassionate to affirm somebody in something that could make their life so horrible down the line that they would commit suicide. From a legal standpoint, I mean, I'm not, you'd want to talk to Will or somebody like that, but I would think that you're opening yourself up for something in a legal sense if you're saying, yeah, I think you should go ahead and take these life-altering medications, or these life-altering, do this life-altering surgery, or these things that can't be reversed, when you have no clinical experience with it and you have no relevant experience with it. So just from that standpoint, I personally would never feel comfortable giving anybody any sort of medical advice. And this is really what they're doing in that case. They found in England that they can't, right? So that's already in the high courts there. The other thing I always tell people, you don't trust a 16-year-old or a 15-year-old, let's say. We don't trust a 15-year-old to drive a car. We don't trust a 16, 17-year-old to go to war. We don't trust a 20-year-old to vote or drink alcohol. And yet we're going to let them make a decision to cut off body parts and change things from a hormonal perspective that can't be undone. So if we don't trust people at those ages to do those very basic life things, then what from a logical perspective would make us think that they could make that kind of choice? There's varying studies, right? But the most commonly cited study states that 94% of children who experience gender dysphoria type events or situations will eventually grow out of it if left just to be a child. And there are critics who will say, no, that study was wrong, it's super flawed. The real studies show it's 65% of those children will grow out of it. Regardless, whichever study you use, 65 to 94% is the majority of children. If you do not even intervene, will just eventually grow out of it, and then they will identify with their God-given biological sex. So that it's actually intervening in something and then trying to sway a child one way or the other when the chances of them actually not having a real issue is problematic. I mean, we're seeing people who are definitely not Catholic who are pushing back against this gender ideology. So there's a very big difference between the gender ideology and people who suffer with gender dysphoria. So people who suffer with gender dysphoria are people that come to us and we treat them with love and compassion. We walk with them. The ideology is an ideology, and we reject that. And so from a standpoint, there are feminists out there who are pushing back at gender ideology because it is inherently anti-woman. So you have situations where you have men playing on women's sports teams, biological men playing on women's sports teams, and you have years and years and years of political activism to get these sports teams equal for women. And now all of a sudden we've just undercut that. So you have a lot of feminists just for that reason alone are saying no. And a lot of feminists who are siding with the Catholic Church's understanding of the person, your biology is your biology. So those are non-Catholics. That's just one example. And so there are a lot of non-Catholics who will see this as a safe haven, if you will, from that gender ideology and be able to say, this is somewhere I could put my child, that they won't be subjected to this in the public schools. There are going to be parents who disagree with us in the in the Catholic schools, who maybe ascribe to the gender ideology, or maybe their child has gender dysphoria and they are unwilling to see the Catholic Church's wisdom in it. And that's going to be a one-on-one situation with the principal of that school. And how do we move forward? Can we move forward? And are you partnering with the Catholic school for the education of your child? Because the Catholic schools are here to partner with the parents. If they can't do that, then it disserves the child to have them taught one thing in the school and taught a different thing at home.